I was sitting at my desk yesterday morning, and it was near the end of my day, wrapping up a couple of things. Did want to point out, in fact, one of those things I was wrapping up is Russ Fulcher is going to join us Friday morning on the air. I don't normally have guests right at the top of the show because we try to do what we call the setup. But Mr. Fulcher was he was away for a few days with family issues, and it's called a vacation. Well, some families being with the family and being with them all the time for a week, that's a struggle. But he wrote me back and said that they've been taking a few days off, but he would be available at 8 o'clock in the morning on Friday. So I said, good enough. We're trying to make available opportunities for candidates. I think yesterday we marked 1 year until the primary for governor in Idaho. So we're down to about 364 days, but it's 52 weeks away, I believe. Now, with that said, we'll talk to all of the candidates early, and then we'll probably step back from politics, at least the candidates for a while during the summer, because, gosh, it's going to be a long campaign. But I'd like all four of them, and technically there's a fifth, but I'd like these people to come in and each get an opportunity in the beginning to talk about why they'd like the job. So we've talked to Tommy Alquist. Russ Fulcher will join us Friday. We still have to get Lieutenant Governor Brad Little on the air. And then the big dog got in the race yesterday, and I was sitting at my desk when Benito Baeza walked out and said, "Did you know that according to Tommy Alquist, Raul Labrador is now in the race?" So I immediately started doing some checking. What had happened was Labrador filed for his paperwork that he's a candidate, but there was no. It was very quietly done. And Betsy Russell, who works for the Spokesman Review, and I mentioned it yesterday on air. There's a joke that makes its way around the halls of the state capitol that Betsy Russell often knows things before legislators even know things. Betsy Russell had picked up on this, that Labrador had filed, and she was already reporting about it. And then the other candidates started to react to it. And essentially, at the moment, it's all very nice. You've got four guys. I saw three of them at the Republican Lincoln Day breakfast in Jerome a couple of weeks ago, and they're all getting along just fine now. A long primary season will change that. Then there'll be a primary, and then after the May primary, there'll be a couple of months where there's a lot of what you'd call introspection from the three guys who will not come out at the top. But then they'll all get behind the one candidate going into the fall election next year. That's how that works. So with the announcement by Labrador's office, the goal is obviously to get him on the air to talk about his campaign. And he has said he is not running for re-election in 2018 to the U.S. House of Representatives, which means it opens up that as well. So Northern Idaho is up for play. I read, though, where a Democrat looking at the possibility of winning that seat, taking that seat back, would be almost nil. It was rated according to a rating system that was put together by some of the observers in Washington who look at political races as what they call R21. That means they took the average of the last couple of presidential elections, and the candidate for president in that district has come up with a victory on average of 21 percentage points ahead of the Democrat. In other words, it's a safe seat for Republicans now. Somebody somewhere in that part of the state will come forward now and say, and very quickly, that they're going to be running for a Labrador seat. I've got a couple of ideas who that might be, but it'll be interesting. I've got a couple of people I'd actually like to recommend, but I'll see how the chips start falling here in the next few days. I think that I have a couple of ideas about people who would be very good in that role, and a lot of people are thinking about running and probably wouldn't be good in that role. So I'm not trying to be wishy-washy here. I'm just telling you that's how that works. The Labrador story got picked up and then started to make national rounds. But the mainstream media types, they can't report the story without saying, just the other day, Mr. Labrador made controversial remarks about health care, as if somehow you as a voter in Idaho are standing back and saying, well, gee willikers, I guess that means I'm going to have to be a liberal and vote for Democrats. They don't get it on the other side of the country. They don't get it in the Beltway of Washington or in Manhattan, and they don't get it on the left coast either. People here aren't like they are. So I don't know if it's going to have an impact, but I wanted to add a couple of other quick things about Labrador's announcement. A lot of the people who back Russ Fulcher love Raul Labrador, but they're worried that these two will split the vote, which is called the constitutionalist vote. I had a post after Alquist was on the show with us a couple of weeks ago. I posted the interview at a number of different Facebook pages that are read by members of various Tea Party factions around the state of Idaho. And some guy immediately chimed in from Idaho Falls that Tommy Alquist was just there to take votes away from Russ Fulcher. He was a plant, and he was going to give the race to Brad Little, and that was the goal all along. Well, I sat here and spoke to Tommy Alquist for half an hour a couple of Fridays ago, and the next day I told him what this fellow had said on Facebook, the reaction, and I was going to say, Tommy, it seems to me you're actually going to take more votes from Brad Little than you would from Russ Fulcher. But before I could even get the word out, Brad walked into the lobby. Tommy Alquist looked at me and said, I'm going to take more votes from him. So we both agreed on that. He's not an establishment candidate, but he would be more along the lines of being able to pick up votes from Brad Little. So those two now are competing for that wing of the vote. One is a developer, and the other is the sitting lieutenant governor. And then over on the other side, you have the two guys who are constitutionalists. So it really becomes somewhat of a wash as to who is going to take votes from somebody else. But some of the Liberty Republicans, as they call themselves, are unhappy that Labrador now is in because Fulcher had already announced. Well, does that mean if you're looking for a job, if there's a job posted on the bulletin board and you see it, that if somebody saw it first and they went in for an interview last week, that if you decide to go in for an interview today, that they should get the job because you're a week late? Everybody else jumped into this race way early. The people were getting in late last year with the election still almost 2 years away. So it bothers me when I see that, as if somehow, well, since Russ planted his flag, it's his. And I'm not endorsing anyone yet. I'd like to sit down and actually talk to all four candidates. And I have the advantage of doing that because of I'm sitting here behind this microphone and I've got guest microphones too. But I'd like to talk to all four, and then I can make up my mind down the road. And it may well be, I'll put it this way, 25 years ago, I was working as a reporter at a news radio operation, big one. And I used to go, they had 11 awards that the State Associated Press would give out every year for news. 7 of those were related just to your team, that is, you and your coworkers, your efforts at covering various events. But there were 4 individual reporting awards, and I used to go pick those up every year at the convention, the AP convention. But I wanted to be one of the anchors on air. I wanted to be one of the news anchors. And I remember one time making a plea because I'd been there a while, and the boss says, but man, you're really good at what you're doing. In other words, they felt my best role was to be the guy on the street with a live unit. I would report live from fires and from homicide scenes, and I would follow politicians around, and I literally didn't have to sit in the office. I was always out on the street. But I wanted one of those jobs doing hourly news behind the microphone. And he said, no, but you're really good. In other words, he looked around the room and realized the other guys may not have been as good as I was at what I was doing. And because of that, I was not allowed to become one of the anchors. And it really ticked me off because I had a little girl at home at the time, and I had sneakily had a suspicion that the anchors were getting paid more than I was. And I wrote most of the news copy that they read. I was the guy who was standing out during big snowstorms up to my waist sometimes, reporting in the snow. I was the guy out at flood scenes. I'll never forget. I was at a flood scene. I was in my television days, and I was waiting to go on with the 11 o'clock news, and we weren't on the air yet, and David Muir was our main anchor at the time. Of course, now he's at ABC. David was looking at the floodwaters around me where I happened to be, and David said, hey, he was talking to me in what you call your IFB, and he said, there's a manhole cover just over there behind you. Why don't you go stand on that? That'll look really cool. And I said, all right, good idea. And I turned around, and as I started walking over there, the water was so deep, and it was about 35 degrees out. All that cold water ran into my boots. And then David said, I'm going to push you back in the lineup to the second story. So I'm standing there with my teeth chattering. And I always thought that I should at least get a premium for that type of work. Eventually, because I couldn't get into the anchor desk, I decided I was going to change direction, and I went into news management and then eventually became a radio talk show host. Found that to be much more enjoyable. Anyway, the fact is, though, a guy like Raul Labrador, he's got a family, but he has to get on an airplane and he's got to fly to Washington for work. And then he's got to fly home. And as I'm told, those flights, and there aren't many direct flights coming into Boise. He lives up in Eagle. There aren't many direct flights. So first of all, that was a bit of a challenge. In the Freedom Caucus, which he's a member of in Washington, there's a fellow named Andy Harris. Andy Harris lives in Annapolis. When Andy got out of the Navy, he never moved. Andy just simply has to drive downtown. He drives down Route 50 onto New York Avenue in Washington, and then he hangs a left turn, and 6 blocks away he's at the Capitol. When they're done in the evening, Andy gets in his car, drives 6 blocks back the other direction, turns right on New York Avenue, which becomes Route 50, and then into downtown Annapolis. That's easy. Labrador, though, just may, and he's not an old man. He's only 49 years old, so he's likely got kids at home still. He'd likely be able to spend more time with them if he was governor. So to sit here and say, no, well, it's for Russ. He shouldn't do this. He should get out of the way. Well, who are you to tell somebody what type of job they should have? I keep reading, well, he's good at what he does in Washington, so he should stay there for us. Well, I know he's your representative in northern Idaho, but the fact of the matter is, like other human beings, they have ambitions and goals and other things they'd like to do. And if I came along today and let's say you're working on the back of a garbage truck, but you'd like to eventually be the driver, but I said to you, no, you're doing a really good job for us at the back of the garbage truck. We're going to leave you there. You might not like that idea. You might think that you've earned or that you have the ability to drive the truck. I know that's a bad analogy when we're talking politics. Well, maybe not. But I'm telling you right now, I don't see this as being one person taking votes for another person. You're going to have 4 candidates, and they're all going to make their presentations. And as Republicans, we get to choose then. You know, they've got to do their sales job. This is a job interview. We get to pick one of them at the end. Simple as that. Somebody said, I read where somebody said yesterday, well, maybe he should run for a lieutenant governor, meaning Labrador. The guy is all over national news. Do you think he's really going to be a lieutenant governor? Come on. And there are already several candidates running for lieutenant governor. That can't get any more crowded as well. There's 4 Republicans for governor, 4 for lieutenant governor, and we haven't even heard from the Democrats yet. So this is going to get mightily exciting if you're a political junkie over the next few months. I've got to take a short break. It's 57. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I do want to point out, you can chime in as well after the break, 736-0300, 736-0300. I was telling some of my fellow Republicans not long ago that there is a conservative tide, a constitutionalist tide of these liberty Republicans coming in the state. And I've been telling them that for a long time. That doesn't mean I'm endorsing it, although I feel a kinship with these people. And for a long time, I would get these dirty looks, and finally one of them said to me a few weeks ago, he looked at me and said, you might be right. I want to talk about that in a little while. Actually, if you're looking at the Times News this morning, the Chuck Malloy column, I think that's his name, he gets into some detail about that. So I'm not the only one who's noticing what's going on. Quick note, if you're planning on finding someone to sit down and work with you on putting some money aside for a rainy day later in life, a kid's college education, I'd like to recommend the good folks at Waddell & Reed here in Twin Falls. They've been in business since 1937, one of the oldest firms offering mutual funds. Waddell & Reed owns and manages 2 mutual fund families. Investing by a conservative nature, they help you build proper expectations. Do they know what they're doing? They've been in business 80 years, folks. I think that's a pretty good answer right there alone, just at the time that they've been doing this. At Waddell & Reed, they'll help you build a plan around your individual needs and goals. They help you manage the money as well, and at Waddell & Reed, they take planning personally. Caller joining us. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Hello?
Good morning.
Good morning. I just want to say I grew up in the Match Valley, but I lived up in North Idaho for 8 years, and Raul was such a great guy. I've met him a few times up there, and no matter what you did, You could be shoveling crap. He wouldn't care. He'd treat you just the same as he would treat anyone else. That's all I want to say.
And I was just actually you said something that I was telling Dr. Tripp before he left the office today. The doctor was getting ready to leave after his segment, and I mentioned I was going to be talking about Labrador in the next half hour. And I said my impression of him, and when I've dealt with him, is that he is. I mean, he is. His scruples when it comes to honesty are unquestioned. But he's a really nice guy. And in politics, you often meet people and they're trying to snow you when you're talking to them. I've referenced Terry McAuliffe, who's the governor of Virginia right now, who I've known through family contacts for about 25 years. Whenever I used to talk to that guy and see him at family events back in the 90s, he would talk to me with a painted on smile. I thought he's trying to put something over on me. And you get that feeling with a lot of people in politics. When I got introduced to Raul Labrador at the state Republican convention last June, and somebody said, Steve Millington, in fact, walked over and said, he said, Representative, I want you to meet someone. And Raul turned around, and as soon as Steve said my name, Raul got a big beaming smile and said, Bill. He shook my hand and was glad to finally meet me. He'd been on the show a number of times already. And I was telling Dr. Tripp, here's a guy who grew up in poverty in Puerto Rico. And then when he was, 11, 12 years old, ended up moving to Las Vegas. And then ended up being raised in a home by a single mom. Look what he's accomplished from all of that. I mean, that's just astounding that he's been able to put all of that together. So he's got a great backstory. And when he's on the air with us, too, he's never shied away. I even asked him about running for governor last week on the air. I put him on the spot in that situation. He didn't know I was going to be bringing that up again. And he handled it. He handled it very, very well. It wasn't difficult for him to respond to that. He just jokingly said, "I'll have a decision soon, and when I do, I'll tell everybody all at once." In other words, you're not getting any scoop out of me today, which is fine. I understand how that works because there are other people around the state who then gripe that he didn't clue them in advance. 57 right now. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And I referenced this column, and I believe his name is Chuck Malloy, and it appears in most of the newspapers around the state. You can find it in the Times News, and I was looking at it this morning. Conservative clout growing in Idaho House. And then he starts out by mentioning that Heather Scott, who comes from northern Idaho, and a lot of the establishment Republicans don't like her. You may know that already if you're a political junkie in this state, but she sent out a letter to constituents just talking a little bit about the recently concluded legislative session. And he said that she wrote that the conservative base is growing, especially in the House. And I had mentioned this to some other Republicans here in the Magic Valley who tend to be of a different stripe when it comes to their Republicanism. I said, you got to realize a year ago there were just two of these people in the House. It was Heather Scott and Ron Nate. Now there's somewhere on the nature of 9 of them. And they've got a few more over in the Senate. And then when we had the lawsuit filed against the governor's veto of the repeal of the grocery tax, you got 30 legislators combined between House and Senate who signed on board with that. So the numbers obviously are growing. And if you're one of those more middle-of-the-road Republicans, you've got to realize you can't just go around and keep, swatting at these people and tamping it down because their numbers are growing now and so fast. The numbers are growing so fast among these people. I'm telling you, it reminds me of that scene in the movie Dances with Wolves. Longtime listeners to the show will realize I often make an analogy and then I go back to it a couple of months later. There's a scene in the movie where Graham Greene's character, who's playing the Indian, he asks the question of the Kevin Costner character, how many more like you are coming? And Costner says, well, not many. But then later in the movie, the two men have become really close friends, and Costner says, I wasn't really true to you when I gave you that answer, when I said not many were coming. And Graham Greene's character says, well, how many are coming? And he said, points up at the sky and says, as numerous as the stars in the sky. And it's the first realization that a culture is going to be drastically changed. That's what's happening, I think, in Idaho politics at the moment. And this is a quote from Scott. We started 3 years ago with a few Liberty legislators willing to speak out and stand up for citizens' freedoms on the House floor. By the first week of the 2017 session, that number had tripled. These Liberty legislators have shown they are more concerned about the citizens they represent than pleasing leadership. Their peers are getting reelected. And then it goes on to say, Mr. Malloy writes, Speaker Scott Bedke received an F plus. That came from a Wayne Hoffman's organization, the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Bedke received an F plus. Apparently, is too liberal by the Freedom Foundation standards. Assistant Majority Leader Brent Crane, though, got an A minus. He may be seen as a better fit for the job. So there could even be a shakeup coming as the numbers grow in actual leadership. And if you're a member of the old guard, the question becomes then, all right, how do we accommodate these people? And that's a question I think that's still being crunched by a lot of folks. 9:30, it's 57. Bill Cowley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Got more coming up in just a couple of minutes. Are you a guy who leaves your grocery cart out in the middle of the parking lot? I got a story to share with you about that.